Good evening, friends. This teleconferencing is titled Gadar Movement, and we are going to focus on one of the founders of Gadar movement, that is Pandurang Khan Khoje. Now, you read about the Gadar movement in your EHI 1 course, the course on modern India. Today, what we'll acquaint you with a personality who has not been highlighted in the historical literature. None of the historians seem to have written about it, except a few stray odd references here and there. And certainly, I mean, he doesn't seem to have found a place in the textbooks. Now, this kind of an omission of the professional historians has been recently been rectified. His daughter, that is Dr. Savitri Khan Khoje, who's with us today, she has actually put together a book based on his collection of his personal private papers. Dr. Savitri Sahni is a pediatrician by profession, and as such, she doesn't belong to the club of the professional historians. But that should not deter us. I mean, the amateur historian is a very important genre, or a very important contributing factor into the development of the historical profession. Edward Said once remarked that it is the professional historian actually who makes the profession that of a virtuoso, and literally puts the business of doing and writing history out of the purview of the enthusiast, the common man, and maybe even the student as well as the professional historian. With an amateur historian, we connect with the vitality of the search for the past, the passion for the past. And this connecting, or this connecting is something which is very important for renewal of our own quests in search of history and the past. It gives us a renewed vigor. And this is by no means being pejorative or condescending or anything of this kind. It's actually an appreciation of the fact that history actually ultimately is done by people who actually start from scratch when they do a new topic or look for a new theme or look for records of the past. So it's that vital connecting point which Dr. Savitri Sahni has brought us to, and the very fact that she has been able to highlight one of the founders of the Gadar movement in her book, which has been recently been published by Penguin, says a great deal about where where she has brought the field of amateur historian to. I think it's a very energizing and a very important kind of a contribution she has made. Now, local or amateur historians normally use, like any other historian for that matter, use family records, local records, as well as records which are used by professional historians. And in her book, the highlight obviously is the personal papers which she has of Dr. Pandurang Khan Khoje. And those papers form the backbone of the writing of the book, as it were. And also, I mean, as she tells us, this story, she says, would never have been written without the painstaking efforts of my Belgian mother. Forgive me for the pronunciation, Jean Sindic, in preserving every scrap of paper scribbled by my father. Every letter and newspaper cutting was carefully kept and catalogued for future reference. His vast collection of photographs and scientific papers, outdated books, and useless memorabilia was beautifully preserved. And this formed the basis of what she wrote. Now, Pandurang Khan Khoje is an important figure in his own right. I mean, as a Gadar movement armed revolutionary, the tracing of his trajectory, of his career, or his quest rather, is important in the sense that he makes, from being an armed revolutionary of the Gadar movement as a freedom fighter, he makes a transition to becoming an agricultural scientist of repute in Mexico, where he is exiled because the British don't want him back. He's classified as a dangerous, he's in the list of classified dangerous persons, which the British circulated. Now, this transition from a revolutionary, armed revolutionary path to the path of an agricultural scientist, while keeping his commitment to the poor and the downtrodden intact, not only poor and downtrodden in India, but poor and downtrodden all over the world. Now, keeping his nationalist and internationalist perspective, internationalist commitment to the downtrodden, and making this transition is a fact which we need to highlight, and which perhaps Dr. Sahni would highlight in her account when she tells us about his life. She's going to speak for about 15 minutes, and another important thing, this transition is important also because the fact that revolutionary movements and left movements in India and elsewhere tend to get caught up in a cycle of violence, and it's a vicious cycle which they cannot get out of. Therefore, probably we need to turn to some of these early leaders to look for the ways in which they made these transitions. And perhaps in this story today, Dr. Sahni will highlight this transition, as well as tell us about her father's quest. So I now hand you over to Dr. Savitri Sahni. She'll be speaking for 15 to 20 minutes, recounting her father's quest. And in between, if you have any questions to ask, you please go ahead and ask. We will, after she finishes speaking, we'll have a small kind of a discussion where you are free to join. Let me hand you over to Dr. Savitri Sahni.
Well, I'm here to tell you a story of the transition of a life of a revolutionary to one of peace and agriculture. But it is not really a transition, it's more of an evolution. It's an evolution of a man who started off as a poor Brahmin boy brought up in the very strict ethos of a Brahmin, and who rose up to become an internationalist, a very liberal man, and a scientist. It is a transition also from war and revolution and violence to one of peace and agriculture. It's not an easy transition, like Dr. Mahurkar has said. It's not an easy transition, but I would call this more of an evolution. This story started more than 100 years ago in 1886 when Pandurang Khan Khoje was born. He was born in Varda, which in those days was called the village of Palakwadi. There he used to listen to the stories of his grandfather, Venkatesh Khan Khoje, who had fought in 1857. Now this gentleman had not only fought with Tatya Bhil, the regional tribal leader, he also had joined Tatya Tope's forces in 1857. So the tradition of revolution and revolutionary thought was instilled on him by his grandfather. Venkatesh Khan Khoje, he was a fierce, wild man who really fought in 1857 with Tatya Tope, and he came back and used to tell the young boy hair-raising stories of independence and the fight in 1857. The young child was naturally entranced with his stories. So he started getting developing a thought for independence, and he said, I am going to help make this country independent. So he did. He founded a Bal Samaj at the very young age of about 11 or 10 or 11, maybe 12. He started a secret society which he called the Bal Samaj. They used to sit there and extol the virtues of Rani Lakshmibai, Tatya Tope, and all the other 1857 heroes. They used to talk a lot about Shivaji and all the revolutionary songs and patriotic songs of Vishnu Chiplunkar. So the process started there. A little later on in life, he founded the Bandhav Samaj. The Bandhav Samaj was actually a secret society. They had already established some sort of contact with the Anushilan Samiti of Bengal. The Anushilan Samiti of Bengal was a very secret revolutionary organization of Bengal, and they started their connections with them, and they used to get people coming from outside to instill in them the revolutionary thought. It is said that at one time that one of the Chapekar brothers came and talked to them and told them that why don't you all join the secret militant branch of Lokmanya Tilak. Those were the days of the great Lokmanya Tilak. Lokmanya Tilak had said that Swaraj is my birthright, and that is what these boys wanted also. So the greatest hero and Pandurang Khankhoje's guru was Lokmanya Tilak. When Lokmanya Tilak started the Swadeshi movement, these young boys joined, and with a great glee they used to make bonfires, what they used to call the holy bonfires of Swadeshi. All the foreign goods were burnt, and they would only use Swadeshi stuff. They would make buttons and clothes and things like that. This carried on for quite some time, till in 1906, after he had finished his high school, Khankhoje had finished his high school, he went to meet Lokmanya Tilak in Pune. He spent 3 weeks with him. There Lokmanya Tilak told him, look, we are not allowed to carry arms here. The British repressions are very strong. You better leave this country if you want to join the independence movement and fight a war. So he advised him to go to Japan. Japan at that time had defeated the Russian imperial forces, and it was thought that this was the only Asian country who had defeated the Europeans. So he went to Japan. In Japan, he started the India Independence League. He met a few friends. While in Japan, he got in contact with the revolutionary students of Dr. Sun Yat-sen. Dr. Sun Yat-sen was in those days in exile in Japan. He was starting the revolutionary movement and the foundation of the Kuomintang and all those things at that time. And that is the time when Khankhoje met him. He told Khankhoje, look, what are you doing here? We are teaching you a little bit about arms and ammunition, but you must learn more about fighting. And you must do much more. You can't do anything here. And if you really want to help your country, you must study agriculture. So he decided that yes, Japan, he was nearly starving. He had nothing to eat. He used to earn his living by teaching the Sun Yat-sen revolutionaries English in exchange for a little money so that he could eat. So knowing that there was the limitations, he decided to go to America. He reached San Francisco in 1906, 1907, just after the San Francisco earthquake, and tried to get a job as a coolie. Well, I will not tell you all the adventures he had, till finally he joined the agricultural college in Oregon, and he started studying agriculture. He started going and meeting all the Indian laborers who were working in United States. There were many Punjabi farmers. There were many ex-servicemen who had joined there. And he used to meet the farmers and the laborers and tell them, why are you allowing our country, you have come here now in the comforts of the United States, why are you allowing our country to remain a slave? We should form a revolutionary party, and we should try and do something to gain independence. And so the organization of what they called in those days Azad-e-Hind, or India Independence League, was founded there in Astoria, in Oregon. Khankhoje was a very determined man. He also joined a military academy near San Francisco, the Mount Tamalpais Military Academy. He learned the basics of military training there, and he graduated. How he joined and how he managed to do all this, that's another story. There is not enough time here to tell you about it. But he had a military training as well as he started his agricultural training. He was at that time focused on two careers. One was that of revolution and independence for India. At the back of his mind, he was thinking that if there is going to be an independence in India, I will be needed in agriculture. So that is how he finished in 1910 his training of the Mount Tamalpais Military Academy, and also at that time he made very important contacts with the Mexican revolutionaries. He found that the Mexicans were very akin to Indians. He liked them. He could not speak their language, but he understood they were also fighting a revolution in Mexico at that time. So he found a lot of friends and he made contacts with the Mexican revolutionaries. Yet at the same time, his duality in his career persisted. He kept on studying agriculture on one side, and on the other side he kept on engaging in his military activities. I do know that he used to mention that he only used to sleep about 4 or 5 hours in 24 hours, out of 24 hours. The rest of the time was spent in studying or in laboring, and all his holidays were spent in trying to engage other people into India's independence. By the time the recruits for the India Independence League or Azad-e-Hind had swollen to almost 5,000, some say 10,000. Then at that time he was not alone in all this venture. There was Pandit Kashiram, Sohan Singh Bhakna, and many Sikh laborers who had joined. They were really the backbone of this movement. But the students used to be the ones who used to motivate them. The Pandit Kashiram provided money. He was a wealthy lumber owner and lumber mill owner, and he used to help Khankhoje a great deal. This carried on till they decided they needed a charismatic leader, and that is the time when Lala Hardayal, who really brought the Gadar into the limelight, came. Lala Hardayal became the leader of this movement, and Khankhoje remained as a secret military leader. On one side, he was training the recruits in the military arts, one could say, in ammunition, explosives, and the use of arms. He had with him a lot of ex-servicemen who used to help him. So by and large, his function was highly secret and not much was known. His studies continued and the revolutionary activities continued. Lala Hardayal made contacts with the Germans, who were in those days thinking of embarking upon this war. And so the Hardayal took advantage of this and spoke to the Germans. The German Kaiser was also very interested in getting India into the fold to trouble the British perhaps. And they decided to give aid to the Indian revolutionaries. Then came the First World War, 1914. Suddenly, the whole movement was electrified. All these really bellicose militants, Sikh laborers who had joined the Gadar, wanted to immediately join and go back to India. They sat down and had several emergency meetings. Many of them left to India, and some, like Pandurang Khankhoje, decided, no, my plan was to go to Iran and Baluchistan. He had a dream, Khankhoje had a dream of raising a revolutionary army somewhere in Iran and Baluchistan and enter into Baluchistan. So he took a boat again. Let us not forget the vicissitudes of this man. He traveled all these places without passport. He didn't have passport, he didn't have valid papers, he didn't have anything. Yet in spite of all this, his determination took him all the way to Constantinople, and from Constantinople to Turkey, in Constantinople, that is the present Istanbul, there was a meeting going to be held with the Germans and the Indian revolutionaries and what they called the Berlin Committee. So these people had a meeting in Istanbul, and they got together to decide the various attacks that they were going to take, because the Germans wanted Britain to be engaged in war on this side, to open a third front so that they could weaken the British attack in Europe. Khan Khoja then joined the Wasmus expedition. Wasmus was a legendary figure. He was the German Lawrence of Arabia. He used to disguise himself as an Arab, and he used to travel all over. He could speak the language very well, and he had been given a lot of money by the Kaiser. So Khan Khoja joined this expedition. There were two expeditions. One expedition went to Afghanistan, that was with Raja Mahendra Pratap, and one expedition was to Baluchistan. Finally, they entered Iran. By that time, Khan Khoja had a false Persian passport, and in Iran, with the help of Wasmus and the arms and ammunition provided, they got together an army of about 5,000 soldiers. Some of them were Persian tribals, nomadic tribals, some were German prisoners of war. The war was raging on, so it's not as if peace on this earth. There was a war going on, and there were many of Indian prisoners of war who were captured and who were motivated by Lala Hardayal and the Berlin Committee people to join into this expedition. Finally, Khan Khoja he fought several battles and many skirmishes in Iran, Persian Baluchistan, and he engaged with the tribes in Baluchistan. Let us not forget that India was undivided in those days, and Baluchistan was part of India. So the entry into Baluchistan, into that very, very difficult area that is now being troubled in a different manner, was equally troubled even in those days. So it was easy for them to enter. But General Percy Sykes, the British general, was there with his army. And after a very serious battle in the mountain of Baft, the army was decimated, Khan Khoja was wounded, and he had to retreat and hide amongst the tribals. So he stayed with the Persian tribals till the end of the war. At the end of the war, he again wanted to again fight and take up the fight for independence. After all, India was not independent yet. And that was a focus, sort of a determination that India should be independent. He then heard that Virendranath Chattopadhyay was in Berlin and that he was trying to resurrect some kind of movement towards India's independence. And with Virendranath Chattopadhyay, after many meetings, they decided, and there were many Indians who decided at that time to go and meet Lenin. The Comintern, the Russian Revolution, the communist movement, they had exploded in the world, and the whole world was absolutely mesmerized by this movement. And the communist philosophy and the labor, the proletariat, it was a very exciting time in those days. Chattopadhyay, Khan Khoja, and Ambaluhani, they went to meet, and Bhupendranath Datta, they went to meet Lenin. M.N. Roy took another group, and there was a third group taken by somebody else. They all presented theses to Lenin. There is a lot of work by the Russian historians, and I have here a reference, Lenin in India by L.V. Mitrokin, where they have interviewed Khan Khoja about his meetings with Lenin. It was very interesting because Lenin was ailing and he was not meeting many people. But he did meet Khan Khoja twice. He spoke to him and they had a number of interesting talks. Kankoja says, I have met many outstanding statesmen from different countries before and after my interviews with Lenin, but none of them impressed me as much as he did. What astonished me was that Lenin identified himself with millions of workers and peasants and had their interests at heart. Lenin led an extremely modest life and did not demand any special conditions. Let us say that Lenin became his role model. He was always a Leninist at heart, he said. But the Russians could not help the Comintern, and Lenin could not help Kankoje in his movement towards independence. The Indians returned back to Germany bitterly disappointed. The British Secret Service had located them already in Germany, and there were several attempts at poisoning. As a matter of fact, one of the colleagues of Chattopadhyay and Kankoje was poisoned. Chattopadhyay also, there was an attempt at poisoning which he survived. And fearing for his life and thinking perhaps that the role of the fight for independence was over, Kankoje left Germany and he went to Mexico. And that is where he finally evolved into an agricultural scientist. And there he started a school of genetics and he started teaching agriculture. He opened 30 free schools of agriculture and he did many experiments on corn, wheat, soybeans. He always thought that maybe somehow, sometime, all this would land up in India and would help the Indian farmer. Since he could not help the Indian farmer, since he couldn't return to India, he decided to help the Mexicans. This is the Oregon Agricultural College degree. This is Washington College Pullman, and this is in his student days. This is the pamphlet that they used to distribute when they used to talk about the plight of India under the British. Then this is a college records. This is Sohan Singh Bhakna, who was one of the leaders, founder leaders of the Gadar movement. Map of Persia, which is not very clearly seen, and these are the different photographs taken while he was in Persia. There is many photographs in Persia, but none of his, because he took all the photographs. This is the Wasmus expedition crossing the river, and the army training, Kashgai training camp in Iran, the tribals in Iran, a tribal chieftain, and Kankoje in Berlin in 1920. There are no photographic records. There are no photographic records of the revolutionary activities because they were fighting for their life at that time. But once he reached Mexico and he got established as an agricultural scientist, he made friends with the great Diego Rivera, who painted him at the head of the table, cutting a piece of bread, and he entitled this painting as There Should Be Bread for the Lowliest and the Poor. There is Kankoje distributing bread to all the nations of the world. So we have now that the revolutionary has evolved now into a scientist, an agricultural scientist, plus his humanitarian instincts led him to open 30 schools, free schools of agriculture. He used to spend all his time, and his paintings, the Diego Rivera's painting, showed the development of agriculture in Mexico. Mexico was at the height of agricultural research in those days. Here he is with Diego Rivera in one of the free schools of agriculture, the inauguration of the School of Agriculture. Here it is a poor Mexican farmer, and he made friends in Veracruz with a senator who later became the president of Mexico. And here you have an example of his research. He developed a wheat which was a prototype which could be used in dry farming. It required less irrigation, and this probably was the very, very seeds of what later led to the Green Revolution in India. So his work did enter India. By starting this research on wheat in Mexico, it was able to filter back many years later when Norman Borlaug started the Green Revolution. This filtered to India in the form of the wheat seeds, which were probably initially developed. The seminal work done in Mexico by Pandurang Khankhoje. So there we have, from a revolutionary to an agricultural scientist. He developed a wheat and he developed a corn that was like pomegranate. It had no kernel, just seeds inside and outside. This is the photographs taken by the eminent photographer Tina Modotti, and this is the pomegranate corn, and this is the different studies. So he remained in Mexico, where he got married, and finally in 1951 when India became independent, the desire to come back to India and work in India and put to use his agricultural expertise in India took over, and the Indian government, the Madhya Pradesh government, invited him to head the Agricultural Policy Committee. The Agricultural Policy Committee lasted for 2 years. He returned to India in 1949 and 50. He was returning in 47, but due to the riots of partition, he could not return. So he returned in 49, 50, and part of 51. He remained working all over India and formulating an agricultural policy for the country. He tried to get some job or some work, but everybody told him that he was already too old and he would not get a job. So he returned to Mexico, very sort of disappointed that he could not remain in India and use his expertise to help the Indian farmer. He finally returned in 1956 and passed away in 1967.
Thank you, Dr. Savitri Sani. It was a wonderful kind of account, and I'm sure our students will benefit from this. If there are any questions on the other end, if any of you are there, you can go ahead and ask your questions. I'm just making this announcement, and we'll now have some kind of a discussion with Dr. Sani. She has given us a sort of a narrative of the quest which Pandurang Khankhoje undertook, and she took us through his took us from his childhood days, from the Bal Samaj days to his travels in Japan, and then later on to US, the founding of Gadar movement, and then also and also the attempt to take the revolution, Indian armed revolution, via Persia to India and so on. Now all these constituted, as it were, major events in the life of Pandurang Khankhoje as a revolutionary. There have been arguments amongst historians about his role and so on, Khushwant Singh, and then who tried to dismiss him and so on. But then there are scholars of greater depth and vitality like Harish Puri and so on, who basically established Pandurang Khankhoje's role in the Gadar party. And obviously, as a person who headed the armed wing, he couldn't be all that high profile. So anyway, the point is that after the whole episode of Gadar was over, in a sense, Pandurang Khankhoje made a vital transition. Keeping his revolutionary commitment intact, he made a transition from an armed revolutionary to an agricultural scientist. Something which Dr. Sani has told us came from that chat with Sanyat Sen, an inspiration of Sanyat Sen. And then Lenin, probably she did not mention that, but in her book she mentions that how Lenin talks about caloric and nutritional requirements of the Indian worker and peasant. which probably was an inspiration again to sustain it, because he says, I remained a Leninist, as Dr. Sani told us. I remained a Leninist throughout, and so on. So it's a transition which is worth studying. I mean, the records of Pandurang Khan Khoje are now going to be shortly deposited by Dr. Sani from her family repository to the repository at Teen Murti Library.
Yes.
And it will be open to students like us to go and explore what what he has to say on various issues, and how, and probably chart out some kind of an account. I mean, use the help of the papers and whatever you can find as researchers and so on. We can probably chart out a course for ourselves, or for writing perhaps some kind of account to complement, supplement, or what have you. I mean, in a sense, you need to basically, some kind of a gate has been opened. And that's something that
if I may say something, it's not only Sun Yat-sen and Lenin who inspired him. Let us not forget, I have mentioned in the book, I didn't mention it just now. As a student, the Bal Samaj and the Bhandav Samaj went as volunteers to help the people who were suffering from one of the famines in Vidarbha area.
Okay.
And it was the shocking sight of people dying of starvation that also made a very strong impression on his this
has a very contemporary ring about it. I mean, there are there are suicides in Vidarbha today. I mean,
yes.
That farmer's plight is in a bad shape.
In a bad shape.
So we as students of Indian society and history, we need to take into cognizance that these were the things which actually moved people in those days, and that we should come out of our cocoons and probably connect with.
But famine, they did volunteer, they donated half of their food. The little boys did quite a lot of work with the famine starved people, and that impression remained throughout his life, so much so that if we left any food on our plate by chance, or we would get a very terrible scolding in our personal life. It carried on till the end, that food should never be wasted. And that is the result of all these experiences.
So see the advantage of doing history of the family. And now the thing is, we need to actually ask Dr. Sani, I mean, what are the possibilities of probably, I have here one paper which she gave to me. It's on Mukt Gram movements. Here he had outlined his vision for the growth of agriculture in India, where he envisioned modern technology for agriculture, seeds, complementing with that schools and health facilities at the village level, which he called the Mukt Gram movement. Mukt Gram movement. So he was envisaging some kind of a movement in agriculture, even then, as he stepped into India after his exile. Now this is the paper written around that time.
Yes, it was written in Mexico before he came to India in 1955.
Okay, so if we get, we have material of this kind also available with us, and we need to probably look into it and see, as to how one of the probably the earliest revolutionaries of Indian history, who or certainly a revolutionary who makes this transition, how he was envisaging the nature of agriculture, and probably also questions of rural-urban divide, as we were discussing that day, and we need to see what was being envisioned.
And let's not forget also that, having gone to the United States as a student, he had worked in a canning factory, he had worked in a hospital, he had worked as many things just to maintain himself. He had nobody giving him money. He was a very independent man, and what he wanted is that the villages should be self-sufficient, that they should not have to depend on the cities, or the young people should not have to leave the villages to go to the city. He envisaged setting up a small industries, but not really cottage industries, but a little more technologically savvy industries that could keep the youth occupied and with money, so that they would not leave the villages, and the exodus to the urban areas would be stopped. And that is perhaps what we need today.
Well, there you have it. So there is scope for doing some more work, probably getting getting this vision out in the open. So that's number one. We have highlighted the transition already. Thirdly, I mean, we also need to work out as to what kind of lessons does this hold for revolutionary and left movements. I mean, this is another area probably which would be needed to be probably researched into. And I mean, there is this transition is actually this documentation of this transition is a big, I think, kind of a contribution in terms of telling us as to that, telling us that look, left movements need not be caught up in cycles of violence.
Yes, he did say that violence, in retrospect, after having fought wars and having fought battles and skirmishes, taken part in violent activities, he said that in India, violence will never work. He always thought that it is better to get the people educated, and it is the revolution of education which he thought was the most important revolution that would take place in India, because we have to educate people.
So I mean, these are the kind of things worth exploring in the papers, and probably maybe if one can find some other records. Thank you so much, and we are now about to wind up. Students, we had an account of Pandurang Khankhoje by his daughter, who has written a book based on the personal papers. A history which has not been highlighted before. So it's definitely one up on the professional historian, in the sense that professional historians never probably bother to look into the contributions of Pandurang Khankhoje earlier, and probably even the Gadar is slightly a neglected field. I mean, save for a few stray articles, it's actually not put together as no studies have been as such put together which can help us understand that period of Indian history. The British actually were quite alarmed by the Gadar, by the way. They had passed the Defence of India Act in 1915, and so that possibilities of armed overthrow of British rule looked very real in the face of this kind of movement gaining ground. So all in all, we have had a very good session, and if there are any questions, queries which you want to put across, you can fax them, you can or you can email them to us. These addresses are available to you. In the end, I would want to thank Dr. Sani for an enriching and a very stimulating talk. We have all benefited. Thank you.